greenhouse gas emissions, cumulative effects, and how they're all influenced by our choices, our personal choices. I'm Barry J. Wilson, founder of the Ravenwater Learning Circle, and this is my CFX Connection Cumulative Effects Insiders Report for April 5th, 2024. Let's just talk about the mechanics of carbon taxes and put aside politics for a minute, okay? First of all, I want to share with you a quote that comes from the Cumulative Secotmic Nation about Secotmic law of angst, which stipulates that there are consequences to the people for not respecting the land. And if proper respect is not given, the land and the sky will turn on you. Ancient wisdom. So let's talk about the mechanics of carbon taxes. From a macroeconomic perspective, you and I have some power to influence marine and land use through the choices that we express through the market by how we purchase products and our services, right? Especially things that we have discretion over. So the non-essentials. So carbon taxes are purposefully intended, it's a policy that's purposefully intended to raise the price of carbon artificially above what is the natural market price. And the reason for this is to reduce demand or consumption. So notionally, the idea is that because as individuals, we don't pay directly out of our pocket very much at all right now for the cumulative effects of greenhouse gas emissions, and especially for future emissions, then the theory is that we're not inspired to curb our emissions now because it really costs us nothing. That's a future cost, and perhaps technology will save us. But the reality is we know that that's not true. We know that the increase in the rate of our changing climate is being driven by our emissions, and that many of the effects, while some of them are starting maybe to happen now, most of them are going to happen in the future. So what the carbon tax is designed to do is to make anything that results in a greenhouse gas emission more expensive today. And then a rational consumer will then purchase less because the cost has gone up. So this is just very basic supply and demand economics. Also, though, the policy encourages industry to shift their energy sources to something that is less carbon intensive. And in that way, they'll reduce their cost side of their business and therefore improve their profitability. And in Canada, if you're in Canada and anywhere except British Columbia, the Northwest Territories, or Quebec, you also pay a federal carbon tax. But in those jurisdictions, if you pay the federal carbon tax, you're also eligible for getting a rebate, which means it's supposed to be a net zero. You pay extra in the carbon tax and then you would get a rebate, which would make it zero. But here's the incentive. If you don't buy carbon or you buy less carbon than the average, you still get the same rebate. Therefore, you actually improve your financial position. You actually make more money than you would have otherwise. So is the system perfect? No. Are there externalities in it? Absolutely. But this approach does offer each of us some choice in our discretionary spending and about what kinds of energy we buy. And there's a recent study published in the Journal of Economic Surveys that found, and I'll read here, an increasing body of empirical studies shows that carbon taxes can effectively reduce carbon emissions or at least dampen their growth while not negatively affecting economic growth, employment, and competitiveness. Now, I live in the province of British Columbia, BC, Canada. And this is where the first carbon tax was actually applied in our country, not by the Canadian government, but by the provincial government, all the way back in the year 2008. That's right. Us out here west of the Rockies, we've been paying a carbon tax for 16 years already. And you know what? I don't complain about it either. Just saying. Instead, what I do is change my behavior. So I don't buy as much fossil fuel to burn as I did before that tax was imposed. So one of the examples is I've changed the proportion of energy we use to heat our home from one that was entirely reliant on fossil fuels to one that is a greener energy source. And that's hydroelectricity. Not perfectly green, but greener. Now, there's a study by Brian Murray and Nicholas Rivers that was done on the outcome of this British Columbia revenue neutral carbon tax. It's called A Review of the Latest Grand Experiment in Environmental Policy. And it found that empirical and simulation models suggest that the tax has reduced emissions in the province by between 5 and 15% since being implemented. And at the same time, models show that the tax has had negligible effects on the aggregate economy. In other words, the economy hasn't slowed down because of this, despite some evidence that certain emissions intensive sectors have faced challenges. Okay, so if you are a carbon emission high sector, obviously you're feeling it more. There's some confusion out there, or I guess maybe it's misleading information, that overall consumption has gone up in British Columbia of fossil fuels, and therefore the tax isn't working. But that's actually happened because there's more and more people in the province. There's more consumers, but the per capita consumption has declined. So the tax actually has been working. Now, I wrote an article on LinkedIn in 2016. I called it Vote with Your Wallet. And I'll put the link below this video. You can go look at that. But really, here's what I was thinking then, and I'm still thinking it now. You know, as consumers, we've become increasingly tolerant, maybe even dependent on supply side management. Taking what's made available to us, rather than exercising our power to influence production with our purchasing power. Okay, we're just taking what the market is offering instead of selecting the sources of energy or the products that are made with different types of energy products. Now, have we just come to expect that the government is going to protect us from ourselves? Have we just gotten lazy, maybe? Or maybe we've been lulled into a false sense of disconnect between our consumption and the cumulative effects of commodity production that we ask for. So I ask you to think about the purchases that you make and the activities that are needed to provide that to you. And just as one example, I just canceled a meal supply service it was making my life easier. I was providing, I didn't have to go grocery shopping. It was, I thought, sourcing local food. And it might even have been saving me money given the price of groceries in grocery stores. But I just canceled it. And why did I do that? Because they sent, one of my meals I ordered was salmon. They sent me salmon from Norway. Okay? I live in British Columbia, Canada. Imagine the carbon footprint of importing fresh fish from halfway around the world when we have salmon right here. You know what? I can't support a business that acts that way without considering the implications. So I voted with my wallet and canceled that service. I encourage you to not let ease of supply or just price be your guide. Instead, be informed about your purchases. Exercise your consumer power. And don't get mad. Vote with your wallet. Now, I found a study continuing on this climate change idea, given how we participate and how we maybe unknowingly even contribute to the rise in emissions. And this is a study that came out of Yellowstone National Park. So last year, Karen and I had the opportunity to visit Yellowstone National Park because we were en route from British Columbia to Utah for a business trip, and we were driving down there. So we just did sort of a side route through Yellowstone National Park in one day, saw the most accessible sites, and carried on because we had the opportunity. And it was beautiful. And all that geothermal energy, wow, that's pretty impressive. But there was a study that just came out on April 3rd of 2024 called Quantifying and Evaluating Strategies to Decrease Carbon Dioxide Emissions Generated from Tourism to Yellowstone National Park. And I'm just reading the title here to get it right. Again, I'll put the link is in my newsletter. So if you subscribe to my regular newsletter, you'll have the automatic connection to that. So this was published in the PLOS Climate Journal, and it identified that tourists like us, like Karen and I, and what we did are the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions associated with a national park. That's not what you really think about when you think about parks, is it? I certainly wasn't thinking about that when I drove through it. But the report concluded that the tourism industry needs strategies to reduce emissions and hasten the achievement of global carbon dioxide emission reduction targets. Using a case study approach, we estimated CO2 emissions related to park tourism in Yellowstone National Park, USA, generated from transit to and from the park, transit within the park, accommodations, and park operations. The results indicate that tourism to Yellowstone National Park produced 1.03 megatons, okay, that's 1.03 billion kilograms of CO2 equivalent emissions annually, with an average of 479 kilograms of CO2 per visitor. For me. And almost 90% of these emissions were attributed to transit to and from the destination, which I did, while 5% were from transit within the park as we drove through. Like so many other people. I mean, the road was just jammed with vehicles. Visitors who fly actually only made up about 35% of all visitors, but they produce 72% of the emissions related to transit to and from the park. So at least, I mean, we drove because we were on another trip. But don't get me wrong, Yellowstone is a place that needs to be experienced, and the benefits of being there and experiencing nature, they're awesome. And the more people we can have get that experience, the better. However, it's more about how they come and go to the park where we could improve and reduce emissions. Now, in our slight defense, Karen's and mine, I mean, Yellowstone was just a slight off-ramp for us on our mileage. It was on the way to our business trip that we were going to do anyways. But still, perhaps in the future, if we decided to do that, there would be alternative ways to go there, like public transportation or some other system that will allow us to get off the highway to the park and enjoy that in a less GHG intensive way. Something to think about. And when those opportunities start to emerge, I think we should embrace them. The next piece that I shared in the newsletter was a report that just came out. It's called For Our Future, Indigenous Resilience Report by Natural Resources Canada. And I note a quote from page 61 of the report. Climate change is a cumulative effect related to the history and ongoing legacy of colonialism. Very interesting. So this new report just released by Natural Resources Canada is the first standalone report that discusses climate change impacts, experiences, and approaches to climate change from the perspective of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis living in what is currently known as Canada. And this report acknowledges the distinct knowledge systems and perspectives of Indigenous people and the importance of self-determination in understanding and addressing climate change. And this knowledge and these perspectives are credible and valid on their own, without the need for integration or validation from other processes and frameworks. So I posted a link to the report in the newsletter. I've not had time to go through this report. It's really large. So I haven't been able to go through it all in detail. But I did note 5 key messages on my first look. And here they are. Number one, Indigenous people have unique strengths for responding to environmental and climate change, partly because of the deep historical knowledge and having probably dealt with major changes in weather many times in the last many thousand years. Number two, climate change is one of the many crises that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis face, not the only one for sure. Number three, Indigenous knowledge systems and lived experiences are essential components of climate action. In other words, how we learn from that. As I started off with the Secwepemc law of angst. Number four, the food, water, and energy nexus is central. Okay, food, water, and energy, where they all come together. That's nexus. That's central to First Nation, Inuit, and Métis climate leadership. And number five, self-determination is critical to Indigenous-led climate action. So the report describes climate change as a cumulative effect related to the history of colonialism in Canada. And here's a quote: in the Canadian context, this is directly linked to the imposition of an economic system on First Nations, Inuit, and Métis that is predicated on the forceful removal, dispossession, and criminalization of them. Further, Canada's colonial practices have prevented First Nation, Inuit, and Métis from participating in the Canadian economy, and while at the same time trying to assimilate Indigenous people into liberal capitalist citizens. This context is essential to understand the impacts of a rapidly changing climate on Indigenous economic systems, which are based on relationships that protect the well-being of people, cultural, and knowledge systems. And for sure, cumulative effects is really all about relationship between interacting systems. Great report. I think that there's going to be a lot of knowledge to be gleaned from that. So take a look at that. You can download it for free. And lastly, how then do we go about integrating climate change into cumulative effects assessments? Well, I've been doing this practically in a number of projects for at least the last 10 years, maybe even a little bit longer than that. And in the Ravenwater Learning Circle, we examine how to do that, how to integrate climate change, and the methods actually, relating back to that last article, of how to quantify dispossession in cumulative effects assessment practice. So if you want to go from concept to action, join us at the next Ravenwater Learning Circle Level 1 Cumulative Effects course. Just go to www.ravenwater.ca and you can learn all about that. It's a unique, immersive 4-day intensive workshop with me and the Ravenwater Learning Circle faculty. We have a small group format, keep the number of students very small. We go on the land and learn. We participate in co-creation, utilizing all of our knowledge together. And students get a graduating certificate, private secure access to an online portal with a lot more information, videos, and readings that's constantly being updated. 6 months free access to the CFX library. And when we can, we also provide food and drink during the day. So check that out. I hope one day that we will connect in the Ravenwater Learning Circle. Until then, just remember, everything is connected.